You're listening to Past Imperfect, a history podcast brought to you by the Center for Wisdom in Leadership at SPJIMR. I'm Dinyar Patel. Victor Sassoon is, today, a forgotten figure. But in the 1920s and 1930s, he was one of the richest men in the world, a business titan and socialite who flitted between three very different cities: London, Bombay, and Shanghai. Today, I'm joined by Rosemary Wakeman, whose book, The Worlds of Victor Sassoon, shows how these three cities were symbols of interwar capitalism and globalization. Using Sassoon as a connecting thread, Wakeman argues that, in the early 20th century, London, Bombay, and Shanghai had more in common with one another than their respective countries. They were financial hubs, epicenters of new technology, and places of modernist Art Deco architecture and booming leisure economies. But they were also cities rife with dramatic socioeconomic differences, political ferment, and violence. The Worlds of Victor Sassoon, as we'll discover, was not too different from our own. Thank you, Rosemary, for joining us today. I want to begin by asking you a question about writing the book rather than the book itself. You've written in your book about how The Worlds of Victor Sassoon is a product of the COVID pandemic, something that you completed while the world was in lockdown. I'd like to know a bit more about how you adapted your writing and research methods to, adapt to the changed conditions that we all went through during COVID. And how do you think the pandemic changed how we write books in general?
Well, thank you very much for inviting me. And that's a wonderful question. Really, this book was written with the support of a Fulbright grant. And as a result of that, I was able to spend 2 months in each city. And my stay in Mumbai or Bombay was the first place I went to. So it was before the pandemic. And that made it fairly easy. I was able to stay there for 2 months to actually work in the archives, especially the Asiatic Society archive, which is in the Old Town Hall, which was a really interesting place to work. So that went quite well. But then, of course, the pandemic intervened. And the result of that was that I was able to just spend 1 month in Shanghai and barely was able to make it there and faced a lot of difficulty with visas in the process. The Chinese visa was very difficult to obtain, even with the help of the Fulbright Commission. So that was one result. And then I spent 2 months as well in London, once again during the pandemic, in which I had to go through all of the American processes for vaccines, for evidence that I did not have COVID, et cetera, as well as the British the NHS process for checking on foreigners who had arrived with or without COVID. And the NHS called us every single day to make certain that we did not have COVID or had been checked and had received our vaccines. So I think that certainly traveling globally, the pandemic made a huge difference. So one result of that as well is that I used a lot of online sources, which are thankfully readily available. And the Asiatic Society online material in particular is terrific, but also the Indian Parliament. There were numbers of databases that I could make good use of. There's a paywall for those, and so they're not freely available, but the paywall is not so onerous that you can't find a way. So also, of course, because India was part of the British Empire in the 1920s and 1930s, there was also a great deal of material available in London at the British Library. So the Indian and the Bombay and the London portion of the books in the book was the easier during COVID. The more difficult one was Shanghai, and that was quite clear. But in the end, beyond the obvious question of language, right, which is also an important challenge working on global history. That was my experience. And then I actually wrote the book in Manhattan also during lockdown. So here I am in the same space today in Midtown where I wrote the book actually and tried to use as many online sources as I could.
So, in your book, you've used Victor Sassoon, a figure who was a business titan in his time, but someone who's hardly known today as a connective tissue of sorts between the interwar worlds of London, Bombay, and Shanghai. And today, if you're in a place like Shanghai, people might recognize Victor Sassoon from associations with the Cathay Hotel and many other landmarks in the city. In Bombay, there's some recognition of the Sassoon name, but not much. And in London, chances are people would more likely know, say, a Siegfried Sassoon or a Philip Sassoon rather than a Victor Sassoon. But of course, as you pointed out in your book, Victor Sassoon was a name to reckon with during the 1920s and 1930s. Can you tell us a bit more about the man and how precisely he was such a singular product of interwar globalization?
Right, he's not very well. Victor Sassoon is not very well known. There are a few books that are starting to come out now that evidence his very important role. To a certain degree, I think that he is less well known in Mumbai or Bombay because he left essentially, and the Jewish Sassoon family left Bombay during the Depression essentially and moved on to London and Shanghai. And so he's disappeared largely from the history of the city. I find that somewhat interesting or ironic because, of course, the Sassoon mills, the textile mills in Bombay, continued to work all the way through until the period after the Second World War. So they were still clearly in evidence. But the family itself has disappeared. In London, you're correct. Philip Sassoon, Siegfried Sassoon, other members of the Sassoon family are much better known. But in his time, Victor Sassoon was one of these global gentlemanly capitalists. He was one of the wealthiest people on the planet at the time. And his influence economically as well as politically was clearly global. And I found the evidence of that in the many newspapers all over the world, the American press, the British press, the press in Singapore, the press throughout Southeast Asia constantly quoted him around economic issues, tax issues, trade, et cetera, et cetera. So he was clearly a figure of enormous influence and was known as well, obviously, for his role in horse racing as well. So he had a cultural presence in that respect, as well as an economic presence. And in the end, I think he's most associated with Shanghai, clearly because of his real estate holdings and the degree to which he supported the development of the Bund as well as the British concession as well.
So, in many ways, how was Sassoon a representative of the particular transformations in global capitalism in the interwar period? Was he a unique product of this time? I mean, this is someone who, after all, grew up in London, traveled all around the world, and ended his days in the Bahamas, right?
Yeah, which is really quite interesting. So I think he is representative of a transitional moment from, especially in terms of Mumbai, a transitional moment between the British Empire, right, which was at its height at this moment in terms of its geographic mass and its economic role, and the Depression, the Second World War, and eventually the demise of the British Empire. So he's a transitional figure in a global landscape. And in that respect, he certainly found success. The entire Sassoon family found success within the context of the British Empire. They made tremendous use of the kind of integrated world that the British Empire represented, both economically and also socially. And so he's representative of that world, that is for certain, right? A whole series of global capitalists who worked within the context of the British Empire in a very freewheeling way, because in some ways the British Empire was about these private relationships that had developed over time between banks, trade, capitalism, etc. And at the same time, you see his role as moving towards a more late 20th century understanding of global economics. The ships, for example, in his business arrangements and in his companies are evidence of that. He began to move towards a much more late 20th century joint stock world in which he was able to manipulate finance and funds globally across the world and shift money from the textile industry into real estate and used currency regulations and currency exchange in order to build his wealth. So, all of those were evidence of a late 20th century capitalism that we actually associate with neoliberalism, right? And with a very late 20th century capitalism. So, that's why I think he's a very unique figure representative of this transitional moment between the British Empire and a much more late 20th century understanding of global dynamics.
So I'll return to Victor Sassoon and the three cities in a moment, but I wanted first to ask you a question about your own experience researching aspects of urban history. So I'm aware, of course, that most of your previous work has focused on urban history in Western Europe and the United States. But while working on this book, as well as your previous book, Practicing Utopia, which examines new town movements in the second half of the 20th century, I wonder if you could tell us a bit more of the differences you observed in how urban history is written and practiced in the non Western world, in places like China and India. How, for example, would an urban historian in cities like Bombay or Shanghai see urban history differently from, say, in a place like London or New York?
So thank you for that question. It's a very important one. I actually began to look at global urban history when I wrote the New Towns book, and that was my initial introduction to this very different world. And so the Sassoon book gave me an opportunity to look much more strategically at how one does urban history outside of the West and outside Europe and the United States. And so there are a couple of things I could say about this. First of all, Postcolonial studies gives us a very interesting and good framework for looking at the kinds of questions and the kinds of issues that urban historians need to address when we're looking globally. And that is the clear differences in the way we imagine modernism, modernization, modernity, how those ideas are applied globally, how they differ. So I would say the framework of postcolonialism is an excellent place to start. But beyond that, I think that the differences in the social framing of urban history are also very important. For example, in Bombay in the 1920s and 1930s, the role of caste, the role of ethnicity, the role of religion was primary. And so those are questions that if you just simply work in Europe and the United States, you rarely come upon. So that's one example, and I was delighted in the Sassoon book to try and evidence the role of indigenous families, indigenous business groups, indigenous oligarchy really in Bombay, a business oligarchy that had extraordinary influence over Southeast Asia. And so that was one of my purposes was to bring to light not just the impact of global elites from the West on the non-West, which I think is not helpful any longer, but to look at the ways in which Southeast Asia, in this case, in Bombay or Shanghai, had evidence of their own indigenous way, not just of seeing modernity, but literally an oligarchy, business elites, social issues around religion, ethnicity, caste, etc., that were their own, and that we have to evidence. So those are some of the reality, the challenges, which I think are really important because they give us the opportunity to even rethink the way we imagine urban history in Europe and the United States as well, and what are the kinds of questions we should be asking?
Yeah, I think at least from the perspective of Bombay, the 1920s and 30s are so significant in the sense that while the world is going through the Great Depression and while the British Empire is losing its economic muscle, you see a real resurgence of indigenous capital, indigenous industry, not just things like Swadeshi, which you mentioned in the book, but also big business groups like the Tatas, other big firms like the Scindias really pop up. And in many ways exert a control of the economic space that signals the beginning of the decolonization process.
Yes, I think that's absolutely correct. And, the industries in which they invested globally as well as locally are quite interesting. And it's ones that often urban historians do not look at. And so it was one reason why I was particularly interested in banking, in insurance, and in industries that are not just simply about textiles or industrial might, but also in the sectors that we now associate once again with neoliberal capitalism in the late 20th century, right? So I'm going backwards and looking where did this begin? Where did these sorts of investments and this shift towards the fire industries is what they're called now, right? Finance, real estate, insurance. When did that begin? And it's quite clear that it was often indigenous business families, indigenous business groups that really took the lead in those investments. So what you find in Bombay, for example, are massive investments in real estate, massive investments in insurance, often because British companies were not interested in actually expanding their portfolio. So it was an opportunity for indigenous groups to make headway in those industries. Obviously, the film industry was another very important one in Bombay, and also the cement industry of all things. But those came to represent a kind of an independent Indian capitalism within the 1920s context of the slow demise of the British Empire and their economic influence.
So today, of course, London, Mumbai, and Shanghai are quite strikingly different places. But you've detailed some pretty remarkable convergences from 100 years ago. And I'm just going to quote something that you've written in the book. They best exemplify the connectivity that characterized globalization in the 1920s and 1930s. These cities resembled one another more than they represented their individual countries. So, how did the trajectories of these three cities converge despite such different political, economic, and social conditions at the time?
Right. Yeah. Well, one of the most important themes in this book that I tried to elucidate was the fluidity between these three places, right? And the degree to which global influences had an extraordinary impact locally. And certainly the role of the British and the British Empire here was critical, both in India as certainly within the context of the British Empire, but also the sort of the soft imperialism of the British in Shanghai. So those influences were quite clear. But also, I was interested in looking at the influences, the fluidity of contact, the interconnection between Bombay and Shanghai themselves beyond just the context of the British Empire and London itself. So that's where I began these ideas. And one of the reasons I think that there are similarities and parallels is within the working classes themselves and these migratory working groups of people that went into the millions really in the 1920s and 1930s that were shifting between these places for temporary work, for permanent work. And so what you see here are these influences from below. And they are in part cultural, but also they are political. This was a highly politicized moment. And you see an extraordinary series of strikes in the textile industries taking place in Shanghai as well as in Bombay, right? By a global working class who are suffering under the same conditions, essentially, in part caused by Victor Sassoon and his business oligarchy. And you see the same parallels of extraordinary strikes in London, not necessarily about textiles, but also about a wide variety of other issues. So I think that those social conflicts and those social tensions existed globally, and it was one of the parallels between these three places. And it's evidence of the impact of this global capitalism that certainly for the elites was very beneficial. It built their wealth but that was based on the poverty of the working classes. So that was clearly one very important relationship between the three. Secondly, you can find the impact of global capitalism directly on the landscape of all three cities in Art Deco architecture, which very much was the icon, the symbol of global capitalism and real estate development globally, and the kinds of money globally that was shifting between these three places and then were evidenced on the cityscape. So that's another place to look. There are actually many parallels between them, despite the fact that they were under very different political regimes. And of course, Shanghai was being invaded by the Japanese and was suffering extraordinary violence. So the contrast is clear, but the parallels have often not been taken up. And I think you find them when you look at the interconnectivity, the fluidity of migratory patterns, the fluidity of finance, of money, the fluidity of cultural influences between the three.
I'm happy that you mentioned Art Deco architecture because I'm speaking from one of the districts in Mumbai, which has a lot of it, at least for the moment, Dadar Matunga, which is a district that's unfortunately currently going under a lot of redevelopment and every year you see a few more Art Deco landmarks go away. But still, that legacy of Art Deco architecture in those three cities, as you mentioned, it's part of something much bigger. And of course, you have cities like Tel Aviv or even places like New York and Chicago emblematizing, similar Art Deco development. But is there something unique about the messaging that's in place in Bombay, Shanghai, and London, and the type of Art Deco that's employed here? Is there a particular message that's being conveyed by the type of architecture that's being deployed in these new structures in the 1920s and 1930s?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think that each city certainly interpreted Art Deco differently. And so they put their own kind of local indigenous spin on what Art Deco meant. And in Bombay, certainly, these were Indian architectural firms that interpreted Art Deco for these business elites, especially for banks and insurance companies. But I would say in Bombay in particular, and this was one of the highlights of the research that I did in Bombay, Art Deco was part of a large set of redevelopment schemes. Certainly the Back Day and Green Lines was the most well known. The Gateway of India was another obvious one, but also Ballard Estate, was which is people know very little about, and this extraordinary neighborhood in Bombay that really deserves a lot more emphasis from researchers because it was there where all the influences of global capitalism were literally found, right? Functioned. The port of Bombay, all of the banks, the trade associations, etc. And that whole area around the waterfront in Bombay was redeveloped at this moment, and new piers put in, new warehousing for the textile industry. So Bombay physically changed a great deal in the context of the 1920s and 1930s. Art Deco was part of that. It was part of that architectural symbolism, this vocabulary that represented globalization. And so that I think is the unique quality of it. Art Deco is often studied simply as an architectural design, which is fine. But I think in the 1920s and the 1930s, when it really arrives on the scene, it is a symbol of globalization and it's a symbol of global real estate. And I think that that's what makes it unique at this moment. I think the same thing is true in Shanghai and less so in London, but perhaps there as well. In other places of the world, I think it becomes simply a form of modernity, but not necessarily of the kind of global influences. And the money from real estate that was changing hands was found all over the world for investments in these places. And I think that's what's unique about this moment for Art Deco.
I think in Bombay also there's another unique layer, which is hygiene. Experience of epidemics in the early 20th century led to new town planning methods being employed in the early 20th century. And very interestingly, all the areas that were redeveloped, whether they were new streets like Muhammad Ali Road, or areas that were entirely built from scratch, like Dadar Matunga, where I'm based at, incorporated not just Art Deco architecture, but also a lot of space to ensure that there was breathing room in case future epidemics were, to take hold of the city.
Yes, that's absolutely true. And I think as well in Shanghai, where epidemics were also an enormous problem, and the redevelopment of some of the areas outside Shanghai, in particular, within Shanghai, with the redevelopment of many of the districts with brick building estates, right, that had internal spaces for the residents, and also the redevelopment or the development of areas outside Shanghai by the communist government also were really interesting. There they used Garden City, which is what I'm trying to get at here. They used Garden City principles to set out of these new areas around Shanghai. And that was clearly around hygiene and health issues, as well as taking Western principles and making them adaptable to Shanghai. So I think in both of those cities, you find that. Less so London, but I think there, if you did some research, if we did some research, you would find the same kind of engagement with patterns of garden cities, of the idea of new towns being used in some of these new areas of London in which many of the newest industries were also being installed and built, right? So it wasn't just about residential areas, which is what we think about when we think about garden cities and new towns. It was also about new industries that were going up in outside London or outside Shanghai, as it were. For example, the aviation industry is a very good one to look at, right? And so the government in Shanghai in the 1930s was already building, right, aviation schools, aviation, obviously airports, et cetera, et cetera. The whole infrastructure of aviation outside Shanghai within the context of garden cities, right? And you see the same thing to a certain degree in London and also to a certain degree in Bombay as well. So I think that the 1920s and the 1930s are places where you can see these issues around hygiene and garden city development and the expansion of cities also within the context of new industries. It's quite complex, much more so than urban historians imagined initially.
So that's a good opportunity to talk a bit more about technology. You've particularly mentioned how the interwar period has been understudied from the perspective of the revolutions that you see in things like communications technology, transportation, and aside from airplane travel, I'm talking about things like radio, the wireless telegraph, telephone, faster automobiles. What was it about these three cities, London, Shanghai, and Bombay, that made them so primed for transformation by these technological innovations?
Yeah, I think it is absolutely true that we have understudied the technological innovations of the 1920s and 1930s, especially in telecommunications, which is going to speed up globalization, right? That's the point I attempted to make in this book. So the transactions within business and trade speed up, everything speeds up. The cultural connectivity speeds up as a result of telecommunications. But one of the things that happens as a result of these technological innovations as well as this era of the steamship as well, and I think that marine navigation here is also important, is that it creates a kind of concentration around global hubs, for example, like Bombay, which for the British was the entree into India and the entree into Southeast Asia, and also Shanghai, as well as London, which was the great global capital. So you see this concentration of these technologies related to globalization in these specific hubs. There are others, quite clearly. Singapore would be an important one to take a look at, for example. Hong Kong is another, which I try and add in a bit into this book because it's nearly impossible to talk about Shanghai without Hong Kong. So there are other places, but you see this dramatic development of technologies in these hubs that are connected globally by the steamship and by new telecommunications and are just beginning connectivity by aviation as well.
And you have some fascinating details in your book. Like, for example, Bombay had the densest telephone network outside of Western Europe, I believe, correct?
Yes, that's correct. So I think much more research needs to be done on the new technologies, especially related to telecommunications, because it shifts entirely our sense of what colonialism, what empire is about, right? I think that's one thing. And it adds to the analysis there. But also, I think it gives us ideas into the impact of globalization and where it was felt and how it was felt. Globalization takes place through certain technologies, certain individuals like Victor Sassoon, certain formats, certain industries, right? And that's rather than looking just simply at globalization as this writ large process. I think that the role of historians is to dig down deeply into these processes and find the technologies, find the mechanisms through which globalization takes place and how it changes, how it evolves over time. That's something different than a globalization as it would be interpreted by sociologists or geographers who've done a great deal of work on that for us. But the role of the historian is to really dig down and see how it has evolved over time in relation to these processes and to these individuals and to the economic sectors in which it took place.
So, how did all of this new technology change the way that finance, banking, associated industries were conducted during the interwar years? I mean, how did it impact the workings of Victor Sassoon and his ability to cross different geographical zones while managing the fortunes of the Sassoon family?
Well, yeah, it was interesting that I did not realize this initially, but all of the telecommunications apparatus in Shanghai, all of the telegraph, telephones, all of that, which were brand new in Shanghai, absolutely. The electricity was just being developed in Shanghai. All of those telecommunication apparatus were in the Cathay Hotel, were actually in Sassoon House, right? So he was extraordinarily aware of their impact, and they speeded up, for example, currency exchange rates and how people could take advantage of currency exchange and the exchange of monies worldwide, right? And could take almost instantaneous advantage of those ships, which Sassoon does, right? He converts his money constantly into different formats, different forms, into the yuan, into British pound, etc. So it sped those up and made investments in real estate and finance far more profitable because it was globally done. And the role of the exchange banks here in particular is important because once again, they were responsible for all of the loans, for all of the debt, for all of the exchanges of currencies. And if they could do that much more quickly, obviously there was much more of an opportunity there for profit. So telecommunications in relation to real estate and finance was absolutely essential. And so the historians need to delve into that in much more detail. I made an effort at it in this book. I think it was, a good effort. I'm happy with it, but I think all I've done is to sort of open the door for other researchers and other historians to tackle that in much more detail. There's a lot there in London as well. You see this apparatus that is doing the work of globalization at a speed that was unknown just 10 to 15 to 20 years earlier. And that is going to make an enormous difference in how money flows, how currency flows globally, and is made available to global elites as well as even to folks in the business world who are just under those elites who could make their way in real estate and finance and insurance, even just locally, but could use technologies to put themselves into a profitability from a global point of view.
And I think you see that speeding up within the Sassoon family itself, in the sense that when the Sassoons moved their base from Bombay to London, beginning in the late 19th century, that shift is quite gradual, right? I mean, they keep a base in Bombay for a very long time. And by the time of Victor Sassoon, it seems quite quick, right? That someone like Victor Sassoon can divest of his holdings in Bombay and pour money from a place like Bombay into Shanghai in a matter of months and years.
That's absolutely the case. And it also releases, it frees up his funds, which were, and he would say, stuck in the textile industry, which was failing essentially, or was slowly failing in Bombay. And he suddenly could take it out of there very, very quickly and invest in what were essentially startup companies, right? All over the world. He could invest in oil, and he did. He could invest in all sorts of technology startups. He could invest in real estate in Shanghai. He could use those rapid conversion techniques to take advantage of the political setting, take advantage of shifts from the Depression, and move money around very, very quickly. So I think he's an excellent example of how the funds of the family were freed up very rapidly to invest in what we would call startups quite clearly. And the profitability there was really quite enormous. You particularly see this in Shanghai, where he was flush with cash that he could then invest in real estate, right? And so you see these extraordinary buildings going up in Art Deco style that he financed that was a representative exactly of this kind of speeded up financialization that took place globally.
And of course, a lot of the money was also poured into leisure activity, which I want to ask you next, in the sense that Victor Sassoon spent quite lavishly on different forms of leisure, whether it was flying, clubs, lavish parties, and of course, horse racing. And here in Mumbai, the Sassoon family legacy is still represented at places like the Mahalakshmi Racecourse, which remains a high society venue today. In what ways were London, Bombay, and Shanghai global pioneers in the creation of modern leisure society as we understand it today?
Yeah, well, ultimately, Victor Sassoon is known as a party boy. What we know about him is essentially about his fabulous parties.
And quite a scandalous reputation as well, I believe.
He did have a scandalous reputation. He was a womanizer, took advantage of his money to in many, many ways. And so the legacy of Sassoon has been about that. And I tried my best to avoid that in this book or not to reiterate it. But it was fascinating, once again, to see a side of the 1920s and the 1930s in terms of global culture that has been understudied. And horse racing is certainly one of those, because it was such a a critical part of the way people imagined high society. And the races themselves, not only in Bombay, but also in Shanghai, took place right in the middle of the city, right? The race courses were right in the city, less so in London. It was outside the city, but not far. So horse racing played an enormous role culturally in the way people imagine global elites and their cultural role. And these people, curated their reputations in the same way that people do, actors and actresses and high society and celebrities do today. This is a moment when global elites and global business oligarchies became celebrities. And so Victor Sassoon is a really good example of that. He's not the only one, but he sort of functioned in the heights of this world and was known in all three places as a celebrity himself. So I think that what you see in these three places, because of maritime traffic, which was really quite extraordinary in the 1920s and the 1930s, this sort of global cultural forms existing between these three places. Jazz was another one, right? Which was understood locally in terms of all of the orchestras and bands that took place that functioned within the world of maritime tourism. Also on the radio, jazz on the radio was obviously an important factor in its spread and there the use of new technologies. So there were many forms of global culture, I think, that need to be further studied and can be found that are really extraordinary. There was a very healthy, maybe unhealthy absorption and addiction to speed, right? You've mentioned that already, right? Faster cars, faster bicycles, faster this, faster steamships. So, that was also an indication of the speed of technologies, the speed of the age, the form of modernity in the 1920s and the 1930s that was just very specific to that world. So, those are all useful investigations. Once again, I think there are other places to study this. Singapore, I think, would be a very important one, and I would love to see more study on Singapore going forward. Calcutta, to a certain degree as well, I think would be another fascinating place to look at this.
Yeah, I agree. I think, Singapore, Calcutta, a few other colonial entrepôts would be really interesting places to compare with, Bombay and Shanghai in particular. And, what you talk about the race courses, I mean, I'm just thinking about how race courses have evolved here in India. And in many ways, they've kind of lived up to the legacy that Sassoon and others had put in place in the sense that they've become objects of real estate speculation. I mean, if you go to some Indian cities, race courses have been converted into residential areas. You can still see the outlines of the race course in the roads. And here in Mumbai, there's a lot of debate over what to do with the race course, whether to shift it out and convert it into a public park or make it, of some other use. And a few months ago, there was a proposal to make an amusement park over there.
Yeah, that's right. In Shanghai as well, it was the race course was converted into People's Park. So yes, these divergencies are really interesting. A lot of things took place in those race courses besides just horse racing, right? They were used as cultural venues for all kinds of festivals, for all kinds of parades, for the celebration of holidays of one kind or the next. So they were multi-purpose spaces in some ways that I think needs more engagement. So, yes, it's a wonderful world. I wonder to a certain degree if there's a relationship here between the idea of horse racing and the stadiums that were also being built at the time. The first great stadiums for European football or soccer, for the great exhibitions, the expositions. these stadiums were being built at the same time. So you see this infrastructure of leisure really taking on an architecture of its own in this period of time. And I think the horse racing venues need to be studied in that context, into that larger context.
So the overall picture that you are giving us of London, Bombay, and Shanghai during the 1920s and 1930s is one of lavish spending, tremendous capital accumulation, feverish construction, rampant investment. In other words, just a lot of activity, a lot of building, a lot of money being generated. And in this sense, I want to ask you how these places perhaps change our understandings of the global Great Depression. Because the picture we have of the Depression is exactly the opposite of that, right? That construction stalls, financing falls apart, global investment and global trade, we think at least, grinds to a halt, especially in the years before the Second World War. So, how has what you've done shown us that the Great Depression is a little bit different from what we imagine it to be?
Yeah, isn't that interesting? So I had to deal with that in some way because in doing the research and in speaking to the scholars who have studied this period with so much success, that was the impression. That was the impression of the depression itself, right? And when I began to say, no, I'm looking at the statistics on trade. I'm looking at the engagement in global financing, and I'm just not seeing it. I'm seeing a different side. So there's a couple of things I can say about this. First of all, a lot of our evidence around the depression is largely taken from the national perspective, and because that's where most of the statistics lie. And indeed, when you look at it from the national perspective, you can see obviously the evidence of the depression. There is absolutely no doubt the depression took place. And in many places, it was extraordinarily severe. But I think what we need to look at now is the complexity of experiences during the Depression. Some regions, some places felt it far more than others, right? So the north, right, of England was a disaster. And whereas London was not so much, that was not the case. Yes, the Depression was there, but there were also new industries that were hiring on because they had global trade, right, that was still functioning. So the rural areas of India were hit by the depression far more than Bombay. So I think if you look at it from an urban rural context, if you look at it based on regions, you find different experiences. It's not that it didn't take place, somehow it was magic and it was avoided. It's just that the extent of the depression, the reality of unemployment, the reality of global finance, the reality of trade shifts depending on where you look at it. And some areas profited, some people profited. We know this about the depression, and it was often global elites like Sassoon who could take advantage of the shifts in currency, for example, to make enormous profits. So I think we have to look at the complexity of the depression and find the statistics more locally in order to understand how it took place and who gained and who lost. And I must say, although we evidence a great deal of movement of activity in these three places, especially by global businessmen like Sassoon, the level of poverty was also striking. And that is, of course, part of globalization. Part of its character is that you have great wealth and you have great poverty. And that poverty was exacerbated by the Depression, quite certainly, and in part explains the tremendous social tensions and the strikes and the riots, right? So that was the other side. That was the dark side, the negative side of globalization and all of these processes that we're studying. And I think Shanghai and Bombay in particular are places where you really see that in full evidence on the streets. There's a great deal of archival documentation on this, and it deserves an enormous amount of study.
Absolutely. I agree entirely. I mean, I wasn't fully aware of just how bad things were outside of Shanghai, until reading your book about how, hundreds of thousands of people were crowding into the city, fleeing, the war between the Chinese and the Japanese. And here in India, even though there was no similar conflict, you, of course, have communal conflict and layered on top of that, caste tensions, religious tensions, and of course, just the general atmosphere of poverty as well.
Yes, that's absolutely true. And in Bombay, as Victor Sassoon said, it was absolutely essential to maintain the textile industry regardless of the competition globally, because with every economic downturn or every epidemic in the rural areas of India, what you saw was a flow of migrants into the city. And the textile industry was the only place really where they could find viable jobs unless they became street merchants or were involved in the informal economy in some way. So his argument was at the time that the textile industry in Bombay was essential for some sort of a stability and balance for India as a whole, because it was able to absorb these rural migrants who suffered from so many difficulties and such poverty in rural areas of India.
So, as we come to the end of this conversation, I want to go back to your experiences working and researching in Mumbai. So, as you mentioned, you were here just before the pandemic. You spent 2 months in Mumbai doing research. What particular traces of Sassoon and his world were you able to trace in modern Mumbai? And were there any remnants or ratios that particularly surprised you?
Yes, there are many actually, and this was the joy about doing research, is that I could go on the hunt for evidence of Victor Sassoon. And there are many places. The Ballard Estate is one, because the Sassoon building is still there, and you can go into his offices. And the photography studio where he worked. Photography was another one of his great hobbies, and the photography studio is still functioning there, and it's the daughter of initial photographer who worked with Sassoon that still has that shop and runs it. And I had a wonderful tour of her work, right, and what she has there in terms of archives, which is really quite extraordinary from the 1920s and the 1930s. It's well worth going to see. So the Ballard Estate is one place to find Victor Sassoon, and so is the Taj Hotel. Victor Sassoon held court in the tea room at the Taj Hotel, and so that's another place to go. Obviously, the Sassoon Docks are another place to find the Sassoon family, and the Sassoon Library is still very much there. And also the textile mills themselves now, which of course are quite decrepit. But I had a wonderful tour of some of the old textile mills that the Sassoons owned, to see what remains of them. They're ruins essentially right now. And I know that Bombay is trying to figure out exactly what to do with them, right? They've become part of historical heritage.
We hope they might be turned into skyscrapers.
That's right. They might be turned into skyscrapers. So, what to do with those places, I doubt very much they'll be around all that much longer. But I was able to do tours of them. So, I think the evidence of the Sassoons is still very much on the cityscape, and you can find Victor Sassoon there as well. And of course, the race course is also there. They also had their home outside Pune, where there is also another race course, and there's areas there for the development of the horse racing world. So that's another place to look for the Sassoons as well.
The last question I have for you is I would like you to consider how the cities have changed and diverged or maybe even converged since the era of Victor Sassoon. London, Mumbai, and Shanghai, obviously, today are still preeminent cities globally, but they've taken very different trajectories since the 1930s and the 1920s. Contemporarily, at least, and based on your experience doing research in all of these three cities, what similarities and dissimilarities did you notice?
Yeah, that's quite interesting. London is still a preeminent global financial center, correct? And so in that respect, despite the fact that the British Empire is no longer, London continues to be one center of global finance. And being in New York, I can tell you that the competition between London and New York over being the preeminent global financial capital is pretty intense. So it continues to do that. I think Shanghai, of course, is a very different place, but it's than it was in the 1920s and the 1930s. But it is still quite obviously a center of real estate development, a center for global finance, especially by global companies who have gone into Shanghai with extraordinary intensity, right? So the shopping malls of high end, very glitzy global corporations are very much a presence on in Shanghai right now on the cityscape and its redevelopment into uh, really a global capital of extraordinary wealth, right, in comparison to many other areas of China, that's for certain. It will be interesting to see what happens in the future for Shanghai. In Bombay, it's a different story there because what has happened since then, of course, is the shift that has taken place under Modi, and we will have to see how that transpires.
So, Rosemary, I'd like to thank you for joining us today. Really enjoyed reading your book, and I'd encourage listeners who want to explore connections between these three cities to pick up the Worlds of Victor Sassoon. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much for the invitation. It was a pleasure.